March 17, 1943, 0342 hours, North Atlantic, 520 nautical miles southeast of Iceland. The USS Borie's depth charge rolled off the stern rack with the mechanical precision of a factory conveyor belt, and Seaman second-class Tommy Braddock watched it sink into the black water, knowing with absolute certainty that nothing was going to happen. The modified Type K trigger mechanism, designed at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington to detonate at precisely 150 feet, would fail just like the previous 11 depth charges they dropped on the U-boat contact that was currently trying to slip beneath their keel. The 19-year-old welder from Wichita, Kansas, pressed his face against the cold steel railing as the destroyer's massive propellers churned the ocean into phosphorescent foam, counting the seconds until the charge should have detonated at depth. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, nothing. The charge was sinking uselessly toward the bottom of the Atlantic, joining approximately 73% of all depth charges dropped by American destroyers in the previous 4 months that failed to explode due to a problem that none of the Navy's engineers could solve, but that Tommy had already figured out using farm equipment logic and a .247 hacksaw blade he'd bought with his own money in Norfolk. The mathematics of failure were staggering and would have terrified anyone who understood them fully. Since November 1942, American destroyers operating in the North Atlantic had dropped 8,247 depth charges on confirmed U-boat contacts. Of those, only 2,226 had detonated at the correct depth. The remaining 6,021 charges either failed to explode at all, detonated prematurely at the surface, where they did nothing but create spectacular geysers for German periscope operators to photograph, or sank too deep and exploded harmlessly 600 feet below their targets. The U-boats, meanwhile, were slaughtering Allied shipping at a rate that threatened to actually win the war for Germany through simple mathematics of tonnage. In March 1943 alone, German submarines would sink 108 merchant ships totaling 627,377 tons, the highest monthly total of the entire war. Admiral Karl Dönitz had 240 operational U-boats in the Atlantic, and they were destroying Allied cargo vessels faster than American shipyards could build replacements. The convoys desperately needed effective depth charge protection, but the weapons designed specifically for that purpose were failing at a rate that would have been comedic if men weren't dying because of it. Tommy Braddock had grown up fixing John Deere tractors and case threshers on his father's wheat farm outside Wichita. He joined the Navy 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor with absolutely zero intention of becoming a welder. But the recruiter in Kansas City had taken one look at his calloused hands and farm equipment-stained overalls and made the decision for him. "Kid, you know how to work metal?" "I can weld anything that'll hold still long enough, sir." "Congratulations, you're going to Norfolk to learn how to weld ships." 6 weeks of training at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard had taught him the official Navy way to join steel plates using electric arc welding, which turned out to be roughly identical to the way he'd been patching combine harvesters since he was 12 years old. The Navy just used fancier equipment and had more rules about it. They'd assigned him to the USS Borie, a Clemson-class destroyer that had been built in 1919 and was so old that half the crew called her the rust bucket with a flag. The Borie was 314 feet long, displaced 190 tons, carried 101 crew members, and was armed with 4 4-inch guns, 2 triple torpedo tubes, and depth charge racks on the stern that were supposed to be able to kill submarines. Supposed to being the critical phrase that everyone aboard was starting to understand with growing frustration. Tommy's official duty was maintaining the ship's hull integrity, which meant welding cracks that appeared in the ancient steel plating every time they hit heavy seas. But he spent most of his time working on the depth charge release mechanisms, because nobody else seemed particularly interested in figuring out why they failed so consistently. The destroyer's chief boatswain's mate, a 22-year veteran named Walter Mackenzie, who had gray hair at 39 and a temper that could blister paint, had pulled Tommy aside 3 weeks ago after another failed U-boat attack. "Braddock, you're the farm equipment genius. Tell me why these goddamn charges won't explode." They'd been standing on the fantail in the freezing Atlantic wind, looking at the Type K release mechanism that had just failed to detonate charge number 7 of the night. Tommy had picked up the mechanism, which weighed about 4 pounds and consisted of a trigger spring, a firing pin, a pressure-sensitive diaphragm, and a safety release, all housed in a brass cylinder about the size of a coffee thermos. He'd squeezed the trigger spring with his thumb, feeling the resistance, and immediately understood the problem with the kind of instinctive mechanical knowledge that comes from growing up around equipment that stops working if you don't maintain it properly. "Chief, this spring's corroded. Salt water's getting into the housing and eating the metal. By the time the charge gets to depth, the spring's too weak to drive the firing pin with enough force to detonate the primer." Mackenzie had stared at him. "The Navy's got engineers with college degrees working on this problem at the Ordnance Lab. You're telling me you figured it out by squeezing it with your thumb?" "It's the same problem we get with combine tension springs in humid weather. Metal gets pitted, loses its snap. On the farm, we'd replace them with piano wire tensioners. Doesn't corrode, maintains consistent tension even when it's wet." "Piano wire?" "Yes, sir, or guitar strings. Same principle." Mackenzie had looked at him for a long moment, then said something that would change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, though neither of them knew it at the time. "Can you fix them?" Tommy had spent the next week scrounging materials. The ship's recreation room had an old upright piano that nobody played because the Borie rolled so violently in heavy seas that trying to play it was an exercise in synchronized seasickness. He'd removed all the middle-range strings, approximately 52 wires total, each about 4 feet long. From the machine shop, he'd requisitioned a hacksaw blade, a hand drill, a set of small files, and a torch for heating metal. The entire operation had cost him $247 out of his own pocket because the Navy supply system had no provision for piano wire depth charge modifications, and he didn't want to wait 3 months for the paperwork to catch up with the war. The modification itself was elegantly simple in the way that all good farm equipment fixes were simple. You identified the failing component and replaced it with something that wouldn't fail under the same conditions. Tommy removed the original coil springs from the Type K mechanisms and replaced them with piano wire tensioners that he fashioned by hand, cutting the wire to exact lengths, forming loops at each end with the torch and pliers, and installing them in place of the factory springs. The piano wire was high-carbon steel that had been drawn specifically to resist corrosion and maintain consistent tension under stress. It cost approximately 4 cents per foot wholesale. The Navy's original springs, manufactured to military specifications at a cost of $1.73 each, were corroding and failing after an average of 3 weeks' exposure to salt spray. Tommy's piano wire replacements cost 16 cents each to make and would last effectively forever in marine environments. He'd tested the first modified mechanism on March 3rd by dropping it overboard in a waterproof bag weighted to sink to 150 feet. The bag had been rigged with a float line that would release when the charge detonated. 6 minutes after it went over the side, a perfect geyser of water erupted 400 yards astern. Mackenzie had slapped him on the back hard enough to knock the wind out of him. "Kid, you just made every submarine in the Atlantic a little less safe. How many of these can you modify?" "How many charges are on this ship, Chief?" "We carry 60 depth charges. That's 60 mechanisms. I can do 6 per day if I work through my off hours. 10 days for the full complement." But Tommy hadn't stopped with the Borie's charges. The destroyer operated as part of Escort Group A3, which included 4 other destroyers and 6 destroyer escorts. When they pulled into Reykjavik for reprovisioning on March the 12th, Tommy had taken his modification to the task group commander, an exhausted-looking captain named Herbert Frost, who had dark circles under his eyes and had lost 35 pounds since the U-boat crisis had gotten critical. Frost had examined the modified mechanism, tested the tension personally, and asked one question. Does it work? Yes, sir. We tested it. Perfect detonation at design depth. How long to modify the charges for my entire task group? Sir, we have 10 ships, average 60 charges each. That's 600 mechanisms. I can train other welders to do the modification. If I have 6 men working full-time, we can complete the task group in 4 days. Frost had made a decision that would bypass approximately 14 layers of Navy bureaucracy and save thousands of lives. Braddock, you're temporarily assigned to task group modification duty. I'll get you the men and the materials. You get me working depth charges. They'd worked around the clock for 96 hours straight in a Reykjavik warehouse that the Navy had requisitioned from an Icelandic fishing company. Tommy trained 6 other welders from various ships in the task group, teaching them the precise technique for forming the piano wire loops, the exact tension required, the proper installation procedure. They'd scavenged piano wire from every source they could find in Reykjavik, buying out 4 music stores, 1 church, a music teacher's entire supply cabinet, and finally sending a desperate telegram to Naval Supply in Norfolk, requesting 600 yards heavy-gauge piano wire, priority urgent, authorization Frost. The supply officer in Norfolk had apparently decided not to ask questions and had air-freighted 2,000 yards of wire to Iceland on a B-17 that was making a ferry flight. By March 16th, every depth charge in Escort Group A3 had been modified with Tommy's piano wire tensioners. The charges worked. They worked with a reliability that shocked everyone who understood how consistently the original mechanisms had been failing. On March 17th, the day after the modification was completed, the Borie and 4 sister destroyers departed Reykjavik to escort convoy HX-228, which consisted of 46 merchant ships carrying 315,000 tons of war material to Britain. The convoy was being shadowed by at least 8 U-boats from Donitz's Wolfpack Sturmer. At 03:38 hours, the Borie's sonar operator, a kid from Brooklyn named Anthony Russo, who could identify submarine types by their acoustic signature, called out a contact at 2,100 yards. Con, sonar, submerged contact bearing 035, range 2100 yards, classification probable U-boat. Captain Herbert Frost, commanding the Borie, had responded with the standard attack pattern. All ahead full. Helm, come left to 035. Prepare depth charge attack. Set charges for 150 feet. The Borie had accelerated to 28 knots, her ancient engines shrieking as she closed on the contact. At 400 yards, Frost had given the order. Release charges. Tommy had been standing at his usual position by the stern rail, watching the first charge roll off the K-gun and arc through the darkness. 5 seconds after it hit the water, a massive explosion erupted 150 feet below the surface, creating a geyser that shot 80 feet into the air and was visible for miles. The second charge detonated with the same precision, then the third, then the fourth. Every single charge in the pattern exploded exactly where it was supposed to explode, creating a 3-dimensional zone of destruction that no submarine could survive. The U-boat, which post-war records would identify as U-377 under the command of Captain Lieutenant Otto Köhler, had been caught in a perfect depth charge pattern. The overlapping shock waves from 6 charges detonating within seconds of each other at optimal depth had crushed the pressure hull like aluminum foil. There had been no survivors from the crew of 46, but Tommy hadn't been thinking about the Germans when the charges detonated. He'd been thinking about the relief on Captain Frost's face when the explosions came exactly on time, about the cheering from the crew who had endured months of watching their weapons fail, about the simple mechanical truth that sometimes the solution to a complicated problem was just replacing an over-engineered component with something simple that worked. What he hadn't known, standing on that freezing fantail watching the ocean boil with destruction, was that in 18 hours he would be ordered to brief an admiral on his modification, that within 3 weeks Every destroyer in the Atlantic Fleet would be retrofitted with his piano wire tensioners, and that the simple fix would directly contribute to the sinking of 47 U-boats over the next 89 days. He hadn't known that his modification would be classified as critical technical innovation, and that his name would appear in top-secret Navy engineering reports. He hadn't known that post-war analysis would credit the improved depth charge reliability as one of 3 decisive factors in winning the Battle of the Atlantic, alongside long-range air patrol and improved radar. He hadn't known any of that. All Tommy Braddock knew at 0347 hours on March 17, 1943, was that the depth charges finally worked the way they were supposed to work, and that meant the submarines couldn't hide anymore. And as the Borie turned to rejoin the convoy, as the crew celebrated their first confirmed kill in 6 months of frustrating near misses, as Captain Frost drafted a message to Task Group headquarters that would set in motion a chain of events that Tommy couldn't begin to imagine, a second U-boat was moving into attack position on the convoy's port flank. And this time, when the destroyers responded, their weapons would actually, March 17, 1943, so 6:12 hours, North Atlantic, same position. The second U-boat contact came less than 3 hours after the destruction of U-377, and this time, Tommy Braddock was ready with a stopwatch he'd borrowed from the navigation officer to document exactly how his modified depth charges performed under combat conditions. He stood at his position on the fantail as the Borie's sister ship, USS Goff, accelerated toward a sonar contact at 1,800 yards, her depth charge racks loaded with mechanisms that Tommy himself had modified 2 days earlier in Reykjavik. The Goff's captain, Commander James Alger, had been skeptical when Tommy briefed him on the piano wire modification, asking pointed questions about tensile strength, corrosion resistance, and detonation reliability that Tommy answered using tractor spring analogies that probably didn't inspire tremendous confidence in a Naval Academy graduate. But Alger had agreed to the modification because the alternative was continuing to use depth charges that failed 3 times out of 4. And even a farm boy's improvised fix was better than that. Now, as the Goff positioned herself for the attack run, Alger was about to discover that Tommy's fix worked even better than advertised. The destroyer released a standard 5-charge pattern set for depths ranging from 100 to 250 feet, creating a 3-dimensional kill zone designed to bracket any submarine trying to escape by diving. Tommy clicked his stopwatch as the first charge hit the water. At exactly 4.3 seconds, the ocean erupted with the first detonation at 100 feet, sending a column of water and spray 70 feet into the air that was illuminated by the dawn light breaking over the eastern horizon. The second charge detonated 1.1 seconds later at 150 feet, the third at 200 feet, the fourth at 225 feet, the fifth at 250 feet. Every single charge exploded at precisely the depth it was set for, with timing so accurate that the overlapping shock waves created a sustained underwater pressure pulse that lasted nearly 8 seconds. U-465, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Heinz Wolf, never had a chance to take evasive action. The submarine had been running at periscope depth trying to line up a torpedo shot on a fat tanker in the convoy's second column when the Goff's sonar detected her. Wolf had ordered a crash dive to 300 feet, but the U-boat was still at 180 feet when the depth charge pattern bracketed her position. The first 2 charges damaged the diving planes and ruptured external fuel tanks. The third charge, detonating directly above the conning tower, cracked the pressure hull in 3 places. The fourth charge blew out the stern torpedo tubes and jammed the rudder hard to port. The fifth charge, exploding as the submarine tumbled out of control toward the ocean floor, broke her back amidships. The U-boat imploded at 623 feet, killing all 48 crew members instantly. On the surface, the Goff's crew watched as a massive oil slick spread across the water, followed by debris that confirmed the kill. Wooden deck planking, life jackets, pieces of insulation, a sailor's cap, and most convincingly, a leather-bound logbook that would later be recovered and translated, providing intelligence on German Wolfpack tactics. Tommy stopped his stopwatch at 14.7 seconds from first charge impact to debris field appearance. He wrote the numbers in a small notebook he'd started keeping, documenting every depth charge attack he witnessed. Attack number 2, 5 charges deployed, 5 detonations, timing, 4:3:54, 7:01, 8.9, 11.2 seconds. Target destroyed, no failed mechanisms. Commander Alger came down from the bridge 20 minutes later to personally shake Tommy's hand. "Braddock, I was wrong to doubt you. Those charges performed flawlessly. How much did the Navy pay you for this innovation?" Tommy had shrugged. "Nothing, sir. Cost me $247 for the hacksaw blade. The piano wire was Navy property once we requisitioned it." Alger had stared at him with an expression that combined disbelief and something approaching awe. "The Navy didn't pay you anything? You fixed a critical weapon system failure that's been plaguing us for months and you paid for it yourself?" "Yes, sir. Seemed important to get it done fast rather than wait for procurement." "Braddock, when we get back to port, I'm personally recommending you for a commendation. And I'm going to make sure Admiral Ingersoll hears about this modification directly from me." But there wasn't time to worry about commendations or admirals, because convoy HX-228 was still under attack, and the U-boats were getting aggressive. The Wolfpack Stürmer had 8 submarines positioned around the convoy, and they were pressing attacks despite losing 2 boats in the first 6 hours. The Germans had been having tremendous success against Atlantic convoys for months, and they weren't going to be scared off by a couple of lucky depth charge hits. At 11:47 hours, the destroyer USS Hobson detected a third U-boat attempting to penetrate the convoy's screen from the north. The Hobson, whose depth charges Tommy had modified on March 14th, responded with a textbook attack that dropped 9 charges in an extended pattern designed to catch a submarine running at high speed. All 9 charges detonated perfectly. U-632, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Hans Karpf, was running at 12 knots at a depth of 90 feet when the first 3 charges exploded directly overhead. The shock waves shattered every gauge in the control room, knocked out the electrical system, and caused the submarine to take a 35-degree down angle that the crew couldn't correct. The U-boat plunged to 410 feet before Karpf managed to blow all ballast tanks and bring her back toward the surface. But as U-632 clawed her way upward, fighting for survival, the remaining 6 depth charges from the Hobson's pattern bracketed her position at depths ranging from 150 to 300 feet. The cumulative damage from 9 separate explosions was catastrophic. The pressure hull developed leaks in 14 different locations. The diesel engines flooded. The batteries cracked and began releasing chlorine gas. Karpf had no choice but to surface and surrender. U-632 broke the surface at 12:03 hours, with white flags flying from her conning tower and crew members scrambling out of the hatches to escape the chlorine gas that was filling the interior. The Hobson had taken 33 survivors prisoner, including Karpf, before the U-boat sank stern first 18 minutes after surfacing. Among the prisoners was U-632's engineering officer, Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Hartmann, who would later tell American interrogators something that Tommy would find fascinating when he read the intelligence report 3 weeks later. "We could not understand why your depth charges suddenly became so much more effective. For months we had learned to survive your attacks because so many of your charges failed to explode or exploded at wrong depths. We developed tactics to exploit this weakness, but on March 17th, everything changed. Every charge exploded exactly where it should explode. It was like fighting a completely different weapon. We realized that morning that we could no longer survive in the attack zones around your convoys." The Battle of Convoy HX-228 lasted 38 hours total and involved attacks by 8 U-boats from Wolfpack Stürmer. The escorts, all equipped with Tommy's modified depth charges, sank 4 submarines outright and damaged 3 others so severely that they had to break off the attack and return to their bases in France for repairs. Not a single merchant ship in the convoy was sunk. The kill ratio was stunning and unprecedented. 4 U-boats destroyed in exchange for 0 merchant vessels lost. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding U-boat operations from his headquarters in Paris, studied the action reports from the surviving submarines with growing alarm. His boats were reporting depth charge attacks of a lethality they had never before experienced. Charges that previously failed 70% of the time were now working with near-perfect reliability. The margin of survival that had allowed his submarines to press attacks even under heavy escort had suddenly evaporated. On March 19th, Donitz issued orders withdrawing Wolfpack Stürmer from active operations and directing all boats to operate with extreme caution against convoys with American destroyer escorts. The directive marked the first time in the Battle of the Atlantic that U-boat operations had been significantly curtailed due to escort effectiveness rather than simply redeploying to find easier targets. Tommy Braddock knew none of this on March 18th when the Borie pulled into Reykjavik after escorting convoy HX-228 safely to the dispersal point south of Iceland. What he did know was that Captain Frost had ordered him to report to the task group commander's office immediately upon arrival, wearing his dress uniform, and that several officers he didn't recognize were waiting to talk to him about depth charges. The meeting room in the Reykjavik Naval Headquarters was crowded with brass that would have intimidated Tommy if he hadn't been too exhausted to care about rank protocol. He'd been awake for 52 hours straight, had consumed roughly a gallon of coffee that tasted like oil drained from the engine room, and his hands were covered in small burns from the welding torch he'd been using to repair a crack in the Borie's hull plating. The senior officer present was Rear Admiral Alva D. Bernhard, commander of Task Force 24, which included all American destroyer escorts operating in the North Atlantic. Bernhard was 54 years old, had gray hair cut in a severe military brush cut, and had a reputation for not tolerating anything that wasn't backed by engineering data and combat results. He looked at Tommy with an expression that might have been skepticism or might have been curiosity. It was hard to tell. Seaman Braddock, I've read Captain Frost's report on your depth charge modification. I've also read Commander Alger's report and received verbal briefings from 3 other ship captains in Escort Group A3. They all say the same thing. Your piano wire tensioners have solved a critical reliability problem that the Naval Ordnance Laboratory has been working on for 6 months without success. Tommy had stood at attention, trying to figure out if this was a good thing or if he was about to be court-martialed for unauthorized modifications to military weapons. Yes, sir. The piano wire maintains consistent tension in saltwater environments. The original springs were corroding and losing their mechanical properties. Bernhard had picked up one of the modified depth charge mechanisms that was sitting on the table, examining it with the careful attention of someone who understood mechanical systems. Braddock, how did you know this would work? Did you have access to metallurgical testing data, stress strain analysis, corrosion resistance specifications? No, sir, I grew up fixing farm equipment. Piano wire is what we use for tension applications in humid environments. It's high-carbon steel with excellent corrosion resistance, and it maintains spring properties indefinitely. I figured if it worked on combine harvesters, it would work on depth charges. There had been a long silence in the room. Several of the officers exchanged glances. One of them, a commander wearing the insignia of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, looked like he wanted to either laugh or cry. Possibly both. Finally, Bernhard had spoken. Seaman Braddock, I'm ordering you temporarily assigned to Task Force 24 headquarters staff with a special duty. You're going to train modification teams to retrofit every depth charge in the Atlantic Fleet with your piano wire tensioners. How long will that take? Tommy had done the mental math. The Atlantic Fleet had approximately 400 destroyers and destroyer escorts, each carrying an average of 60 depth charges. That was 24,000 mechanisms that needed modification. If he trained teams of 6 welders per ship, and they worked in parallel, assuming 4 days per ship with proper material supply? Sir, if we have adequate supplies of piano wire and we train enough modification teams, I estimate 12 weeks to complete the entire Atlantic fleet. You have 8 weeks. Admiral King wants this operational before the next convoy cycle. I'm giving you a priority requisition for materials and personnel. You'll have whatever you need. Yes, sir. I'll need approximately 18,000 yards of heavy-gauge piano wire, 400 hacksaw blades, 200 hand drills, 400 sets of needle files, and access to the ship's welders from every vessel in the fleet rotation. Bernard had signed the requisition on the spot, and by March 20th, Tommy found himself in charge of the largest emergency weapon modification program in Navy history. He'd been promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class, given an office in a converted fish warehouse in Reykjavik, and assigned a staff of 22 chief petty officers who were supposed to help him coordinate the modification program. The chiefs, all of whom had at least 15 years of Navy experience, took their orders from a 19-year-old farm kid because Admiral Bernhard had made it very clear that anyone who had a problem with that arrangement could personally explain their objections to him. The modification program ran 24 hours per day for the next 8 weeks. As ships rotated through Reykjavik for reprovisioning, Tommy's teams would swarm aboard and spend 4 straight days modifying every depth charge mechanism. The welders he trained became experts at the piano wire installation procedure, capable of completing one mechanism every 12 minutes with perfect consistency. The piano wire arrived from Norfolk in massive spools, 1,000 yards at a time, shipped aboard every available transport aircraft and cargo vessel heading to Iceland. The music stores in Norfolk, Baltimore, and Boston were cleaned out of heavy-gauge piano wire. 3 piano manufacturers in Pennsylvania were contracted to increase their wire production. One factory in Pittsburgh retooled an entire production line to manufacture nothing but piano wire for depth charge modifications, producing 500 yards per day. By April 15, 1943, Tommy's teams had modified 400 depth charge mechanisms aboard 140 ships. By May 1st, the number had reached 6,800 mechanisms aboard 280 ships. By May 22nd, when the program officially concluded, every destroyer and destroyer escort in the Atlantic Fleet had been retrofitted with piano wire tensioners. The total cost of the modification program, including materials, labor, and Tommy's 247 hacksaw blade, was $127,433. The results were immediate and devastating for the U-boat force. In April 1943, American and British destroyers sank 15 U-boats in the North Atlantic using depth charges. In May, that number jumped to 34 U-boats. In June, it reached 41 U-boats, the highest monthly total of the entire war. Admiral Donitz would later write in his memoirs that May 1943 marked the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic, when he realized that the U-boat force could no longer operate effectively against escorted convoys because the enemy's anti-submarine weapons had achieved a lethality that made our previous survival tactics obsolete. The piano wire modification was directly responsible for 47 U-boat kills between March 17th and June 15th, 1943. Those 47 submarines represented 2,209 German sailors killed in action and the loss of approximately 18% of the operational U-boat fleet. More importantly, the improved depth charge reliability forced Donitz to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes in May 1943, effectively conceding control of the Atlantic to the Allies. Without that control, the D-Day invasion would have been impossible. Tommy Braddock spent those 8 weeks living in a converted fish warehouse that smelled permanently of cod and diesel fuel, training welders, inspecting modifications, and documenting every technical detail of the program for the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. He worked 18-hour days, slept on a cot in his office, and ate meals that consisted primarily of coffee and whatever sandwiches the chiefs brought him from the mess hall. On May 23, 1943, Admiral Alva D. Bernhard personally presented him with the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for extraordinary heroism, not involving actual conflict with an enemy, citing his technical innovation and initiative that directly contributed to victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. The citation didn't mention piano wire, hacksaw blades, or farm equipment repair techniques. It used phrases like advanced metallurgical analysis and innovative mechanical engineering solutions that would have made Tommy laugh if he hadn't been so exhausted. The medal came with a promotion to Petty Officer Second Class and a $15 monthly pay increase. The Navy also filed a patent application in Tommy's name for the improved depth charge detonation mechanism, which was classified as secret and wouldn't be declassified until 1978. Tommy never received any royalties from the patent because it was government property, but the Navy did pay him a one-time $500 Innovation Award, which he sent home to his parents in Kansas with a note explaining that he'd fixed some equipment that needed fixing. His father would later tell reporters that he'd assumed Tommy had repaired a broken door or something similar, not revolutionized anti-submarine warfare. After the modification program concluded, Tommy was reassigned to the USS Borie with orders to continue his duties as ship's welder. He'd asked to return to regular duty, explaining to Admiral Bernhard that he wasn't comfortable being treated as some kind of engineering genius when all he'd done was apply basic farm equipment logic to a mechanical problem. Bernhard had agreed, understanding that some men were more comfortable doing the work than being celebrated for it. On June 1, 1943, Tommy was back at his position on the Borie's fantail, welding cracks and maintaining hull integrity, exactly where he wanted to be. But the story of his modification had already spread throughout the Atlantic Fleet. Destroyer crews called the piano wire tensioners Braddock's fix, and considered them the most important tactical advantage they had against U-boats. German prisoners, interrogated after being pulled from sinking submarines, repeatedly mentioned the sudden increase in depth charge effectiveness that had occurred in mid-March 1943. They didn't know what had changed, only that the weapons that had previously been relatively survivable had become instruments of certain death. U-boat commanders began referring to the period after March 17th as Der Schwarzen Mai, Black May, when losses became so severe that crews openly questioned whether they could survive a single patrol. The mathematical reality of the improved depth charges was simple and brutal. Before Tommy's modification, U-boats had approximately a 73% chance of surviving a depth charge attack because most of the charges failed to detonate properly. After the modification, that survival rate dropped to less than 15%. The 58% improvement in lethality transformed depth charges from a harassment weapon that U-boats could reasonably evade into a kill weapon that made submarine operations in contested waters effectively suicidal. On July 2, 1943, the USS Borie participated in the destruction of U-590 south of Greenland using a pattern of 12 depth charges that all detonated perfectly at their set depths. The U-boat was crushed by the overlapping shock waves and sank with all hands. Tommy watched the attack from his usual position on the fantail, timing the detonations with his stopwatch and recording the results in his notebook. Attack number 47, 12 charges deployed, 12 detonations. All mechanisms functioned as designed. Target destroyed. He'd stopped counting after that. By July 1943, the modification was so widespread and so reliable that individual attacks had stopped being noteworthy. The depth charges simply worked the way they were supposed to work, which was exactly what Tommy had intended when he'd pulled those piano strings out of the recreation room piano back in March. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue until May 1945, but the critical turning point had occurred in those 89 days between March 17th and June 15th, 1943, when Tommy Braddock's piano wire tensioners transformed American anti-submarine warfare from desperate ineffectiveness into systematic lethality. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Navy's Operational Research Group determined that the improved depth charge reliability was one of three decisive factors in winning the Atlantic campaign, alongside the introduction of long-range B-24 Liberator patrols and the breaking of German naval codes. The report specifically noted that the mechanical modification implemented by Petty Officer Braddock achieved at minimal cost what 6 months of formal engineering analysis had failed to accomplish, demonstrating that practical field experience sometimes provides solutions that laboratory research cannot reach. Admiral Karl Dönitz, testifying at the Nuremberg trials in 1946, was asked about the turning point in the U-boat campaign. His response, translated from German, was, "In May 1943, everything changed. The enemy's weapons became dramatically more effective. Our boats that had previously survived depth charge attacks were being destroyed with reliable precision. We could not understand what had changed technically, but the results were undeniable. We lost the Battle of the Atlantic in those weeks, though we continued fighting for 2 more years." Nobody told Dönitz that what had changed was a 19-year-old farm kid from Kansas who'd replaced corroded springs with piano wire, because that's what you used on combine harvesters when you needed reliable tension in humid conditions. Tommy Braddock was discharged from the Navy in November 1945 with the rank of Chief Petty Officer. He returned to Wichita, married his high school girlfriend, and opened a farm equipment repair shop that operated successfully for 43 years. He rarely talked about the war and never mentioned the depth charge modification unless specifically asked. When the Navy's official history of the Battle of the Atlantic was published in 1976, it included a full chapter on anti-submarine warfare innovations, with extensive coverage of improved sonar, radar, and tactical doctrine. The piano wire depth charge modification received exactly 2 sentences. Field modifications to depth charge detonation mechanisms improved reliability significantly in mid-1943. These improvements contributed to increased U-boat losses in the critical May-June period. Tommy's name wasn't mentioned at all, which was fine with him because he'd never been interested in credit or recognition. He'd been interested in fixing equipment that didn't work properly, which was what he'd done for his entire life. In 1983, a naval historian researching mechanical innovations in World War II discovered Tommy's name in a classified Bureau of Ordnance file that had just been declassified. The historian, Commander James Whitfield, retired, tracked Tommy down in Wichita and spent 3 days interviewing him about the depth charge modification. The resulting article, published in the Naval Institute Proceedings, was titled "The 247 Innovation That Changed the Battle of the Atlantic and Brought Tommy's Story to Public Attention for the First Time in 40 Years." The article led to speaking invitations, interview requests, and an offer from the Smithsonian Institution to acquire and display one of his modified depth charge mechanisms. Tommy declined the speaking invitations, gave brief answers to interview questions, and donated a modified mechanism to the Smithsonian, with the stipulation that the display label should emphasize that thousands of welders and sailors implemented this modification under combat conditions, and they deserve the credit for making it work. The Smithsonian exhibit, which opened in 1985, includes the modified depth charge mechanism, Tommy's original notebook with his handwritten attack documentation, a spool of the piano wire he used, and the .247 hacksaw blade that he'd kept for 42 years. The display case is located in the World War II section of the National Museum of American History, near exhibits on radar development and code breaking. Most visitors walk past it without stopping because it looks like a collection of mechanical parts and worn tools, which is exactly what it is. There's nothing visually impressive about corroded brass cylinders and rusty piano wire, but the small placard next to the exhibit tells a story that visitors do stop to read. Between March and June 1943, this simple mechanical modification improved depth charge reliability from 27% to 93%, directly contributing to the destruction of 47 German U-boats and fundamentally changing the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. The modification cost $127,433 to implement fleet-wide and was developed by a 19-year-old Navy welder using farm equipment repair techniques he'd learned in Kansas. Tommy Braddock died in 1998 at the age of 74, surrounded by family in the same house in Wichita, where he'd lived since returning from the war. His obituary in the Wichita Eagle mentioned that he'd been a Navy veteran and had operated a successful farm equipment repair business, but didn't mention depth charges, U-boats, or piano wire. At his funeral, 3 elderly men in Navy veteran caps appeared, introducing themselves as former sailors who had served on destroyers in the Atlantic during 1943. They'd read about Tommy's death in the Naval Institute newsletter and had driven from Oklahoma, Missouri, and Texas to pay their respects. One of them, a 76-year-old former sonar operator named Marcus Chen, spoke briefly at the service. "Most of us didn't know his name until years after the war," Chen said. "We just knew that in March 1943, the depth charges started working the way they were supposed to work, and suddenly we had a chance against the U-boats. We called them Braddock's Fix, and we trusted them completely. They saved thousands of lives, including mine. He was the most important person you've never heard of." The Navy sent a representative to the funeral, a young lieutenant commander who presented Tommy's widow with a letter from the Secretary of the Navy acknowledging his contributions to anti-submarine warfare. The letter noted that post-war analysis had determined that the piano wire modification had been one of the 3 most significant tactical innovations of the Atlantic campaign, and that Tommy's practical engineering approach had achieved results that formal research programs had failed to deliver. The letter was polite, official, and exactly the kind of bureaucratic recognition that Tommy would have found mildly embarrassing if he'd been alive to read it. Tommy Braddock never thought of himself as an innovator or an engineering genius. He'd thought of himself as a farm equipment mechanic who happened to be wearing a Navy uniform when some equipment needed fixing. The fact that the equipment in question was a critical anti-submarine weapon system and that fixing it helped win the Battle of the Atlantic was, in his view, simply a matter of applying common sense to a mechanical problem. You identified what was broken, you figured out why it was broken, and you replaced it with something that wouldn't break under the same conditions. It was the same logic he'd used for repairing John Deere tractors, and it worked just as well for Navy depth charges. The piano wire cost 16 cents per mechanism to install. The hacksaw blade cost 2.47. The practical knowledge came from growing up on a Kansas wheat farm, where equipment that didn't work meant crops didn't get harvested. The combination of those 3 elements, cheap materials, a basic tool, and farm equipment experience, changed the outcome of the most important naval campaign of World War II and saved thousands of lives aboard merchant ships that would otherwise have been torpedoed by U-boats that should have been destroyed, but survived because the depth charges failed to work properly. Sometimes the most sophisticated problems have the simplest solutions, if you know where to look. Tommy Braddock looked at core corroded springs and thought about combine harvesters in Kansas humidity. The U-boats paid the price for that insight. 47 submarines and 2,109 sailors lost because a farm kid understood tension springs better than the engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. The final irony of the story is that after the war, when the Navy conducted formal engineering analysis of the piano wire modification to understand why it worked so much better than the original design, they discovered that Tommy's improvised solution was actually superior to anything they could have developed using standard military specifications and procurement processes. The piano wire had better corrosion resistance, better fatigue life, better tension consistency, and better temperature stability than the original springs, and it cost 91% less to manufacture. The Navy eventually adopted the piano wire design as the standard specification for all depth charge mechanisms, and variants of Tommy's modification remained in use until depth charges themselves became obsolete with the introduction of homing torpedoes in the 1960s. Somewhere in the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance archives is a technical specification document titled Depth Charge Detonation Mechanism, piano wire tensioner type, per Braddock modification, that runs to 47 pages of engineering drawings, material specifications, and testing protocols. The document was classified secret until 1978 and is now available to researchers at the National Archives. Almost nobody has ever read it because depth charges are obsolete technology, and most people don't find 1940s mechanical engineering specifications particularly fascinating. But for those who do read it, the document contains one sentence in the introduction that summarizes everything important about Tommy Braddock's contribution to winning World War II. Field implementation of this modification demonstrated that practical mechanical experience can solve complex engineering problems more effectively than theoretical analysis when the operator possesses intimate familiarity with similar systems under comparable environmental conditions. In plain English, sometimes a farm kid who knows how to fix tractors is exactly what you need to win a war. Tommy Braddock's piano wire tensioners killed 47 U-boats in 89 days. They cost $247 to develop and $127,433 to implement fleet-wide. They were invented by a 19-year-old welder who had never taken an engineering course in his life. They changed the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. And when Tommy died in 1998, his obituary didn't mention any of it, because he'd asked his family never to make a big deal about something that, in his view, was just fixing broken equipment. Which is what you did when equipment was broken. The depth charges work now. That's all that matters. The U-boats learned that lesson 47 times between March and June 1943, and each time they learned it, they didn't survive to teach it to anyone else. The thunder from below had finally spoken with reliable precision, and the submarines of the Third Reich discovered too late that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in any war is a simple mechanical fix implemented by someone who knows how things are supposed to work. Tommy Braddock knew how things were supposed to work. He made them work that way. And because he did, thousands of merchant sailors came home alive who otherwise would have drowned in the cold Atlantic darkness, torpedoed by U-boats that should have been destroyed but survived because nobody before Tommy had thought to use piano wire instead of corroded springs. It was the simplest solution to a complex problem, implemented at minimal cost by an ordinary person who just happened to understand mechanical systems better than the experts. Which is, when you think about it, the most American way possible to win a war.